Okay, it's about 1:05. I'm sure people will be filtering in as we go. As I mentioned before, welcome to Her Justice, one of our first of hopefully many town halls. Justice Talks Financial Abuse. Today we'll be hearing from three staff attorneys from Her Justice, Naomi Young, Anna Agnabene, and Anna Maria Diamanti, discussing various implications of financial abuse and how that falls within our work. Throughout the training, I'm sure you'll have many questions. If you do have any questions, please submit them via the Q&A feature in Zoom, if you're watching via Zoom. That way we can make sure that we see your question, and between each section, one of the attorneys will be answering those questions. If you have any technical issues, please let us know as well. If you're watching via Facebook, please, if you have any questions, please send them via comment. We'll be monitoring that as well. This will be recorded and available afterwards if anyone's interested. And also, as I mentioned before, the resources will be available to anyone who needs them. We'll be sending out a resource list as well as potentially materials if anyone specifically needs them. Also, at the end of this webinar, you will be immediately redirected to a survey. Please fill it out if you're comfortable doing so. We would really appreciate it. It helps us with feedback, as well as just if anyone is interested, and if there are a lot of questions, we don't get to them all, we might be potentially setting up an additional Q&A for anyone who has more in-depth questions about this topic. So without any further ado, I will turn it over to, I believe, Naomi. I think you're handling the first section. And yeah, take it away.
Thanks, Mike. So I'm super lucky to be joined by my supervisor, Anna Agnabene, and then our director of the family and matrimonial practice here at Her Justice, Anna Maria Diamanti, who we call AMD because there are two Annas on this talk. And so this, as Mike said, is hopefully the first of several town halls that Her Justice will be hosting. And for the month of domestic violence awareness, we thought it was super appropriate to talk about financial abuse in the context of the work that we do. So for those of you who are not familiar with our organization, Her Justice is a legal services organization in New York City. Some of you may have known it under the name In Motion. It was founded in 1993, the same year that Ruth Bader Ginsburg joined the Supreme Court, to stand with women living in poverty in New York City by recruiting and mentoring volunteer lawyers to provide free legal help and in order to address individual and systemic legal barriers in the areas of immigration law and family and matrimonial law, and now with some focus on consumer debt defense. So our organization's model is fairly unique from a lot of other organizations in New York City. We have a pro bono first model, which is a leverage model. We use the talent and resources that already exist in New York City, which has many of the top law firms in the world, bringing together committed lawyers with our clients who are determined women in order to secure the life-changing legal results that they need for them and their children. So we specialize then in offering pro bono assistance. So that means we recruit and then train volunteer lawyers from those premier firms, and then we introduce them to our clients who are women living in poverty in the 5 boroughs of New York City. And that's a way that we can leverage sort of the legal profession that already exists in order to try and bridge the gap, the justice gap for women who live in poverty, most of whom have experienced abuse, meaning we can leverage just about, I think we have 12 or 13 staff attorneys right now in order to mentor over 1,800 legal volunteers and serve about 9,000 women and children a year, which comes out to a remarkable value in hours, which if they had been billed would have been a significant amount of money donated. So the clients that we serve, our requirements for qualification for our service would be women living in poverty, which we define as at or below 200% of the federal poverty level within the 5 boroughs of New York City. It is not a requirement that someone have experienced domestic abuse in order to qualify for our services, but it does so happen that about 80% of our clients do identify as survivors of intimate partner violence, and also because of the nature of the legal relief that we work towards providing. About 64% of our clients are mothers, and 51% of our clients were not born in the United States, and 1 out of 4 cannot access the legal system without an interpreter. These are all demographics which are largely underserved throughout the country and experience much greater barriers to justice than many of the litigants that you might see in higher courts or in divorce court generally, because typically you're not going to be able to afford an attorney. So within the work that we've already done, my supervisor, Anna Ognabeni, conceived of the idea of a marital debt project within our matrimonial practice and recruited me to join her in developing that project as a fellow and now as a staff attorney. The idea behind this project being that as our clients are coming to us seeking relief in family and matrimonial law, we are issue spotting for financial issues, especially for financial abuse issues. And as Anna Maria will explain, that's so incredibly prevalent in the population that we serve that this was becoming an urgent need for our clients. And given that we are screening our clients for these issues, we also decided to develop an understanding of consumer debt in order to assist these clients holistically and do financial safety planning and legal advocacy within the consumer debt field as well. So within our presentation today, we are talking about, Anna Maria is going to be talking about screening for financial abuse or identifying it. I'll be going over consumer debt basics, and Anna is going to share with you remedies for financial abuse within family and matrimonial law, and then we'll kind of close it with a financial safety planning section. So I'm going to turn it over to AMD.
Thanks, Naomi. Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're very glad you're joining us today for this, which is a really critical and excellent topic to touch upon during Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So I'm going to start with talking about what is financial abuse and spotting it in its various forms. So to start, we're talking about this issue in the context of domestic violence or intimate partner violence. And many of you have seen what's on our next slide, the domestic violence power and control wheel. If we could get to the next slide. Yep, there we go. And so we use the power and control wheel to help sort of define what we mean by domestic violence. So domestic violence is a pattern of coercive and abusive behavior that's used in a relationship to try to gain and maintain power and control over the other person. So by looking at the wheel, and again, I know many of you have seen this, that the overwhelming, overarching threat of physical or sexual violence is ever present, but the sort of day-to-day methodology of abuse can take many forms: coercive behavior, threats, intimidation, emotional abuse, isolating the victim and children, minimizing the abuse, denying and blaming it, using the children as a means to exert control over your partner, using male privilege, immigration privilege, color privilege, all various forms of privileges. And there's also economic abuse. Now, we're focusing today on intimate partner violence, which means we're focusing on violence between people who are in an intimate relationship, who may also be married or who may also have children together. But I just want to be clear that financial abuse can be present in any kind of family dynamic where there's abuse going on. So it can be an issue between parents and their adult children, for example, between siblings where there's abuse going on. For example, a person maybe who has a mental or physical disability and their caretaker, there may be financial abuse patterns happening there as well. But today we are focusing on intimate partner violence. So the statistics tell us that financial abuse is very common in abusive relationships. It's a very common tactic, and that it's a very effective method of control. If you can control someone's finances, or if you can restrict their access to financial resources, you really can restrict their options for securing independence, for getting out of an abusive relationship, and for staying out of an abusive relationship. And so that's why it's so common, because it's very effective. We also know that the widespread nature of financial abuse has a tremendous rippling effect. It doesn't just affect an individual person, but it impedes her ability to gain wealth, which hurts her children, which hurts the larger community, which hurts our economy. And it has this tremendous rippling effect in our society. Despite that, it's often overlooked or not taken seriously enough as other types of abuse. It's not necessarily as obvious as other types of abuse. Although it also often works in conjunction with other types of abuse. And I'm going to go through some examples shortly, but you'll often hear, for example, that someone was threatened or assaulted because of the way she spent the money, or because she tried to access money that the abuser felt that she wasn't entitled to, or told her she wasn't entitled to. The abuser may berate or belittle the victim for the way she spends money, or for trying to get a job, or even try to interfere with that job. You may often hear of sexual abuse in the context of financial abuse, forcing sex or sexual behavior on someone in exchange for getting money for groceries, or something to that effect. So it often works in conjunction with other types of abuse. And again, just before we go into examples, I also want to be clear that, this can sometimes be hard to distinguish, or hard for advocates or for court personnel or law enforcement personnel to distinguish between, poor financial planning, or these people are just bad with money. This is not the same. We're not talking about something, we're not talking about a situation where two people have agreed that one person is going to primarily be in charge of the finances because that's what they do and they're better at it. And we're also not talking about a situation where someone just really isn't good with money and is having financial trouble as a result of it. Really, what you need to look at when you're talking about financial abuse in the context of intimate partner violence is, what are the dynamics of the relationship? Who makes decisions and why? Is this about control, dominance, humiliation, or anything of that nature? And that's what makes it financial abuse, as opposed to, this is just how our family works. So with that, financial abuse can involve one or more tactics, and many cases involve multiple methods. So one example is controlling how the money is spent. And just to give an example of this, I recently spoke to a client whose spouse sits her down every day, every week, with all of the bills and receipts for every single dime that she spends, and she has to go over in great detail and justify every single expense. And if he doesn't believe the expense is warranted, if he doesn't believe it's justified, he becomes threatening and even violent. And so if he feels as though her explanation as to why she needed this particular outfit for this particular occasion, or this type of food, or why she went to this grocery store as opposed to a cheaper one, if he's not satisfied with her answer, then what follows from that is violence. And this is, as you can imagine, is tremendously disturbing for her. It's frightening. And it also really impedes her ability to provide for herself and her children, because every time she's in the grocery store, she has to sit there and think through the possibilities of, if I buy this cereal, which is a little bit more expensive, but the kids are more likely to actually eat it and not waste it, am I going to be able to justify to my abusive spouse that it was worth the extra 20 cents for this box as opposed to the other? So that is a very common tactic. Another is withholding money or giving an allowance to someone. And one example, I had a divorced client whose husband forced her to use her paycheck, her work paycheck, which was much smaller than his, to cover all of the household expenses for her and the children. The only expense he was willing to cover was the mortgage, because the mortgage was in his name. So it was in his interest to make sure it was paid. But if she needed food, if she needed clothing, if she needed anything else, that was her problem. And so that was effectively an allowance. And if she needed more money than her paycheck afforded, he would just tell her, well, get another job or work more hours. And it got to the point where she was in such dire straits that she literally collapsed and was hospitalized from stress and exhaustion because she could not keep up with the household bills. And her husband, who was only covering the mortgage, had lots of money at his disposal to spend as he pleased. So that was effectively giving her an allowance. Very related to this, and this comes up in couples who are already separated or who are separated and have children together, you often see this with non-payment or reduced payments of child support, where someone is deliberately withholding or not paying the full amount of child support that they're supposed to pay. And they often do that in conjunction with tactics to evade enforcement of child support. So they'll work off the books, they'll close their bank account so you can't garnish the money from the bank account. They won't file taxes. I had a case where someone didn't file taxes for something like 10 years, and that was deliberate. He'd rather face the wrath of the IRS than face the withholding penalty for failure to pay child support. So oftentimes that becomes a control mechanism of, I'm not going to pay the child support, I'm not going to give you the money that you're owed, and good luck trying to collect it. Another tactic is withholding basic necessities. So for example, not providing money to buy food, not providing money to buy clothing or other necessary items for the household. One particularly horrific example of this I had in a case of mine many years ago was I had a client who had high copays for her medication, which she very much needed. She had a very debilitating condition. And the abuser would refuse to pay the copay unless she acceded to his sexual demands. So this was sexual abuse in conjunction with financial abuse. And so she often had to choose between feeling sick and so debilitated that she couldn't function because she couldn't get her medication, or being humiliated by her abuser. And for a very long time, she put up with this and dealt with this without help because she was too ashamed to reach out to her doctor and explain that this was why she was not taking her medication consistently. So she was really alone and isolated as a result of this. So again, you can imagine how, as an abuse tactic, how effective that can be in keeping someone from leaving or ending an abusive relationship. You have this horrible cycle of shame, violence, and abuse all sort of coming together and keeping that person isolated. Another very common example we see is forbidding or outright sabotaging employment efforts or attempts to get employment by the victim, by the abuser. So interfering with the ability to either get or keep a job. And this can be as simple as, assaulting the person and leaving visible marks or bruises such that she's afraid or ashamed to go to work and show up and have to try to explain why she has a mark on her face or cuts on her arm or whatnot. And it can also include tactics such as, swiping or keeping people's paperwork so that they can't apply for jobs as needed, not hiding their identification or hiding their social security card or whatever else they may need to secure a job. Another example I had, which was, again, pretty egregious, I had a client who was an immigrant and her citizen husband had been refusing to help her adjust status. So he was also using immigration privilege in conjunction with this. And during the time they were together, she tried to get 3 different jobs. The first 2 jobs, he showed up to her place of employment, and in front of customers, in front of her coworkers, in front of her boss, he just started screaming that he was calling ICE, he was calling immigration, he was going to have you all arrested for employing this illegal person working here, and how dare you, and he's an American, and this is outrageous, and how could you? And he caused such a scene at her first 2 jobs that her employers basically said, look, we feel really bad, we're so sorry you're going through this, but we can't put up with this, you have to leave. The third job, he did the same thing, and at that point, she was so embarrassed and so ashamed, she just quit. So that, again, a very effective method, because she couldn't work consistently and she couldn't build up an income and she couldn't build up a little nest egg for herself. It took her a very long time to escape that relationship. Another related example, just taking paychecks. Victim in the relationship works and the abuser literally takes the check or the money away and says, it's mine, or I'm going to determine how it's spent. But this can also be done covertly. To give an example, a few years ago, I had a divorce case where my client wasn't even aware this was happening. Her paycheck was being deposited into a joint account. So it was a direct deposit into a joint account between her and her husband. And she didn't have much access to this account. He controlled the account. But we discovered during the divorce that he had been secreting money and transferring money from the joint account into a secret certificate of deposit account that was in his own name. So he was literally stealing the money surreptitiously without her knowing. And she only discovered it once she was actually able to get an attorney, and I was able to issue subpoenas and actually get those accounts and review them. In her mind, though, she had all this money saved, all this wealth built up from her income, from her paycheck going into an account, and then suddenly it was gone. Luckily, though, because of the fact that we were in a divorce proceeding, we were able to preserve that money for her. Another common example, and Naomi's going to talk about this in more detail, is identity theft. Identity theft can range from the extreme or the obvious examples to very subtle or sometimes not so obvious examples. So one kind of extreme example of this, this was actually a case I had in a different state. I had a client who was married, and she and her husband were both on the marital home, on the deed and the mortgage. And so, of course, when the husband wanted to get a second mortgage, she would have had to sign off on it. So we discovered that the husband managed to get an unidentified woman, we never figured out who this woman was, to go with him to the bank and sign her name, pretending to be his wife, so that he could get a second mortgage on the house. Now, in this case, we were very lucky. We did a lot of advocacy with the bank, and they were very sympathetic when she detailed just how severe the physical abuse was, how awful the situation was. And so they actually pulled their security footage and looked at the person who went into the bank with the husband and confirmed that, yes, this was not the wife. So they wiped out her liability and they went after him. That was very fortunate, though. First of all, they had the security footage to look at, so that was one advantage. But the other thing that was important to understand about why this worked out for her was, this was a very difficult thing. She had, in order to get the bank's sympathy and cooperation, she really had to detail how horrific the abuse was. And that was really difficult for her. That was a very embarrassing thing to have to do to pretty much total strangers who, she has accounts there and she's going to have to deal with them in some capacity in the future. And she really, that took a real act of bravery on her part to come forward and say, I've been abused and that's why I need your help. So that was a particularly egregious example, but there are other sort of more subtle examples. For example, signing a spouse's name on a tax return or a check without the spouse's knowledge or permission. Many people don't even realize that can constitute identity theft. You just think, oh, I'm allowed to sign for my spouse. Well, not without their consent or permission. You're not, especially if you're incurring debt in their name without their knowledge or permission. Related to this is the issue of forced or coerced debt. And again, Naomi's going to discuss this further because it's a very common problem that we see. This usually comes in the context of the abuser either having bad credit, him or herself, and can't take out loans or can't incur liabilities, or deliberately saddling the victim with a liability so that if and when the abuser and or the victim can't pay that debt, she's the only creditor and she's the only one legally liable for it. We see this very commonly with auto loans. Victim takes out a loan for the partner or the spouse because the spouse can't, and then the spouse takes the car and doesn't allow the victim access, and then maybe doesn't even make the payments. And next thing you know, the victim has this outstanding loan, and there's maybe even a repossession, but it's somehow affecting her credit, going on her credit report, or causing her harm. We also see it with credit cards, forcing someone to take on credit cards or just taking away their credit cards and incurring the debt on their behalf, essentially. In one particularly egregious case, I had a client who took out student loans, and depending on how your student loans are structured, you can get a certain portion of the money for your living expense, for your personal expenses. So for example, if you don't live in a dorm, but you pay rent, you can take what would be dorm related expenses and pay rent with it. And in that case, her boyfriend took all the monies that she was supposed to use for living expenses and spent it on himself. And she ended up with substantially more student loans than she really used towards her education. And she also ended up with a lot of debt in her name. Another common scenario we see is weaponizing someone's financial status. As I mentioned, with forced or coerced debt, taking advantage of someone's good credit and forcing them to take on loans. But there's also the flip side of it. Often our clients already have or unrelatedly have bad credit or financial problems. And so the abuser takes advantage of that situation to essentially make that as an excuse to have everything in their own name, to have all the assets or anything that appreciates, for example, a home in their name and their name alone. So again, we see this very commonly with deeds and mortgages. I'm going to put the house in my name and my name alone, therefore it's mine. And they can, in New York State at least, they can sell it without their spouses or their partner's permission or even knowledge if it's solely in their own name. And it's done under the guise of, well, your credit's bad or you're bad with money, so I'm just going to take control and take charge of everything. And then one final example I'm going to give is filing fraudulent tax returns. Again, very common. This is a very complex issue. We're going to discuss it a little bit further, but especially around some concerns around the stimulus checks that are coming that are tied to people's tax returns and tax filings. But two really important possibilities that I want to highlight and just make sure people are aware of so that they can red flag it and also help clients strategize around it. For spouses, if you file jointly and you have a tax liability, that is a joint liability. And the IRS can and will collect it from either or both spouses. So many, many times we've seen cases where someone filed jointly with their spouse, they incurred a tax liability. She got out of the relationship, filed her own tax return, her own separate tax return, and was supposed to get a refund, and it was garnished due to that prior joint liability. That's one common problem. Another common problem is when spouses or even people who aren't married but have children in common file conflicting returns. So either one spouse files joint with the other spouse and the other spouse files separately, that's problematic, or each parent files claiming the children as a dependent. Both of those situations can result in a tax audit. In fact, it will very likely result in a tax audit. And we'll discuss resources to help and to get clients in the best position to come through that tax audit as smoothly as possible. But I want to make sure people are aware that those are sort of the two big issues that we see around tax returns. So the last thing I'm going to touch on just very, very quickly are some stats. And again, this just goes to show, and I'm not going to go through these in real detail, but this just goes to show how prevalent financial abuse is and how significant a problem it is, not just on an individual level, but on a societal level as well. So some of these stats really demonstrate that this is the financial abuse is present in the vast majority of domestic violence cases. A lot of folks are losing jobs as a result, or they're impacting their ability to work, meaning they're taking time off that they might not otherwise have taken. They're losing income, they're losing hours at work. And that has a huge rippling effect. We're talking about thousands of jobs that are affected, and thousands of employers and communities that are affected as well. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Naomi, who's going to talk about consumer debt issues and financial abuse as well.
Thanks, Anna. So the intersection of consumer debt and domestic violence is a topic that's starting to get some more attention in order to address and understand the impact of the financial abuse that Anna Maria was just describing. It's important to have a grasp on some consumer debt basics. And I know we have some consumer advocates on this call. And so they're definitely the folks that I've included on our resource list as well. But the idea here being that we should all, as people who live in the United States under this system, understand a little bit about what we mean when we're talking about consumer debt issues. So consumer debt involves most types of debt that you could think of, including credit cards, auto loans, your student loans, your utility bills, rent arrears, which just by the way, don't appear on your credit report. And what it doesn't involve is what we would call government debt, and that would be tax liabilities or public benefit overpayments, Medicaid overpayments, things like that. And we can talk about how the government has powers to sort of seize your money that private creditors don't necessarily have. The weird category is student loans, which obviously can be either, you know, private or government, but we kind of lump that into the consumer debt category. The other big thing that everyone should understand is that if you have a social security number in the United States, you have a credit score, you know, as long as, you know, you're an adult, and unfortunately, sometimes if you're a child. And a lot of times clients who have an ITIN number and have been getting credit on their ITIN number may also have a credit score. That score is based on something called your credit history. A credit report and a credit score are not synonymous. I apologize for that. And the idea is that your credit score is based on factors in your credit history. The biggest of those being your payment history in that piece of the pie for the FICO score, which is the most commonly used score. And then the second big slice of that pie is your payment history. So we're looking at making sure that those are the factors you're looking at, especially when you're thinking about building, repairing, or maintaining your credit. Another big thing is the length of your history. So for those of us who haven't had credit for very long in our names, it just may not be as good as it will be in 20 years when we have also a diverse range of credit, having taken out mortgages or whatever else to let our capitalist society know that we have an interest in owning property and that we are not a credit risk. The other important thing to think about in terms of consumer credit basics is who actually owes the debt. We will talk about running your credit report in financial safety planning, but when you're looking at your credit report, what the answer to this question is usually under a heading that says type of account, individual or authorized or joint. And the idea, the difference really between being a joint account holder or a co-signer and an authorized user is a difference in liability. So if you sign on as someone's co-signer to a loan, you are agreeing to pay if they don't. So think twice if your child asks you to sign on to a Parent Plus loan, for example. The reason that it's easier to get credit if you have a co-signer is because that means that the creditor has two different people they can go after. If, however, you are an authorized user on someone's account, that does not mean that you are liable for paying the debt or can be sued on default. Usually an authorized user is in the context of a credit card. And so, for instance, if I had a kid and I let them be an authorized user on my credit card, I would be the only one responsible for making payments. But if they were to go on a spending spree with my card, that would definitely impact my credit. And likewise, if I did that to them, it would impact their credit. So that's just an important thing to note about that issue. In the context of partner abuse, and specifically where the partners are married, this is where we're talking about the intersecting areas of law between consumer law and matrimonial law. These are two different worlds, but they interact in important ways that different issues might arise. So consumer law is contract law. So the person liable for a debt is going to be whoever signed the contract. In that context, if a spouse pressured their spouse into taking out credit in only their name, and that is super common, especially in the context of auto loans, that would not be considered a defense. And we'll talk more about defenses later. However, if they outright stole your identity, that is considered a defense. In the context of matrimonial law, and matrimonial law really means divorce law. In the context of getting a divorce, we talk about something called equitable distribution, which Anna will be getting into a little later as well, in terms of dividing up what is called marital and what is called separate debt. If you acquired a debt during your marriage, even if it's only in your name, then it's going to be presumed to be marital. And so arguably, you could ask a judge to divide that debt up in a divorce judgment. However, if that divorce judgment divides up a debt only in your name, then for instance, if a guy named Peter is ordered to pay 50% of a debt only in his wife Mary's name, and he violates that divorce judgment and doesn't pay his equitable share, the original creditor cannot then go after Peter because the only person liable to the creditor is Mary. So Mary then, however, if the creditor goes after her, can turn around and use that divorce judgment to go after Peter for his fair share of whatever the creditor took from her. So that's just the kind of the way that those two things interact with each other. An important thing to understand about owing debts is that if you default on them, the creditor will try to collect them. They will do, this is what is meant when they're calling people incessantly, and there are rules about whether or not and how they're allowed to contact you. But in the context of a lawsuit, which is how a lot of credit card companies, debt buyers, and banks collect on their debts, a really common way that people find out that they were sued is if they have their wages garnished or a bank account frozen. And this usually involves something called sewer service where they're not being properly served. But this is basically the power that a judgment gives a creditor. And sometimes they get default judgments, and that's when people first find out after the fact. But that's the power that a judgment has. The government, on the other hand, doesn't need to get a judgment in order to seize your money, including your tax refund or a portion of your benefits. And ultimately, obviously, going into collection is going to negatively affect your credit score. Importantly, if you are going through a situation like this, the thing to know is that under a patchwork quilt of federal and New York laws, your income, parts of your income or potentially all of your income is going to be exempt from collection. So exempt income that banks cannot seize would include your public benefits, your minimum wage income, child support, unemployment, things like that. Just quickly, defenses to debt lawsuits. As I mentioned, identity theft is an important defense in the context of financial abuse. Service is a really common defense where someone's not been properly served. And the idea of standing is an important defense in a lot of cases in New York where there's an industry called debt buying, where companies literally buy debt from other companies, but they have to prove that they actually have a right to sue you and prove that they own the debt. Another big one is the statute of limitations, which is a fancy way of saying SOL, you're SOL because you passed the time that the legislature has allowed you to sue someone. And so if you realize you've been sued either because you've had your wages garnished or your bank account frozen or because you received a summons, even if you've received a summons in the mail, you should contact the consumer advocates on the list of resources we're going to be providing, because you should have a lawyer assess whether or not any of these defenses apply to you, which they will, and you will need to assert those in an answer. Just also quickly, that when people are in economic stress, which most New Yorkers are at this point, predators try to take advantage of you. And that means predatory lenders, but it also means industries that have sprung up just to address the fear and panic that comes from being in a lot of debt. So if you hear about debt settlement companies or credit repair agencies or debt consolidation companies, there's a lot of different sort of formats that these appear in. Some of them are legal, some of them are not, some of them are really skirting the line. But the golden rule is if someone's trying to profit from the fact that you have debt and from your fear of that by offering to do something you could do on your own or you could consult with a free lawyer about, then they're probably not looking out for your best interests. And honestly, one of the #1 reasons we see defendants in civil court is because a debt settlement company kind of put them there with the wrong advice. Another quick thing to mention in the context of this amazing year called 2020 is that a huge form of financial abuse that we've seen always has been, abusers taking tax refunds by naming the party's children or their wife as a dependent on their returns. But in this year, it's also been the stimulus checks. So next year, please, even if you don't usually file taxes because you're exempt from doing so, file your taxes for 2020 because hopefully Congress will send another stimulus our way. And so I'm going to turn it over to Anna, who's going to talk about some remedies in family law.
Thanks, Naomi. And before I get started on my section, I was just in the middle of typing an answer to a question that popped up in the Q&A, but I think it's probably worth addressing live for the benefit of everybody as well. And it was about car loans in particular. Car loans are a big issue for our clients and probably many of your clients if you're also serving low-income populations. They tend to be the most predatory and have the worst terms, basically, because except in New York City, which has a great subway system, and even in some parts of New York City where the subway doesn't reach, cars are a necessity, and so people need cars, and so car loan people take advantage of that. I had been typing in the chat window that we are going to be sharing, as Naomi mentioned, a resource list at the end of this. So if you have a client who has a specific issue with a car loan, and the question that came through was about a repossession of a car that sounded like it might have been in violation of lemon laws, maybe, that's definitely something that your client should speak to a consumer debt specialist about, because there may be some defenses to car loans. So I just wanted to make sure I addressed that before I moved on. So thanks again for that question.
And just,
okay.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. If after this this webinar you do not receive the resource list in an email that I'll be sending later, please reach out to the email that was listed on the website. Just my email, mnaro@herjustice.org, or anyone else will be sure to get you that resource list. Thanks.
So my section of this presentation is to talk about some remedies in the family and matrimonial law of New York to address some of these financial abuse and consumer debt issues. And so I want to start with the disclaimer. If there happens to be anybody watching, since we're on Facebook Live, if there's anybody watching from out of state, I'm so sorry. This is a New York law specific piece. If you have questions about the state that you're in, then I would encourage you to reach out to an attorney in that state. But I want to talk about, very briefly talk about 3 separate things that might be of help to people struggling with financial abuse in an abusive relationship. So the first issue that I want to talk about is orders of protection. So Naomi, if you could fast forward the slide for me. To the next one, please. Thank you. So many of you have heard of orders of protection in the context of criminal law. And so if there's been a crime committed, then the police or the criminal court may issue an order of protection, helping that victim in the criminal court system. In New York, we also have a family court system where certain people who are in family or dating or intimate relationships can use the family court to file for their own orders of protection. And in New York, we call it orders of protection. In other states, you may have heard it referred to things like restraining order. It's kind of the same idea. But basically, family court is available for anyone who is a family member, or if you have a child in common with someone, or if you are dating them. You can use family court to file for your own order of protection. You don't have to use the police for that. You don't have to have an open criminal case. And in a family court order of protection, you can get an order of protection against your abuser based on certain family offenses that are written out in the law. And so the family offenses, many of them are what you might expect. So physical abuse, stalking, threats, harassment, sexual violence. All of these things can be the basis of an order of protection in family court. But something that not many people know about is that you can also get an order of protection based on a couple of crimes that would be considered financial crimes. So one important thing to know is that identity theft, in addition to being a crime, and as Naomi mentioned, and AMD as well, I think, it's a crime even if it is your spouse committing the identity theft against you, if it is done without your consent. The very fact that you're married to someone is not implied consent for them to use your identity for financial gain or for your financial loss. So ID theft is a crime. It's also a family offense. And so you can use the fact of the identity theft if it was a person either in your family or you're married to or dating them or have a child in common with them. You can use that as a basis for an order of protection. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that grand larceny is also, in addition to being a crime, it is also a family offense. This one I don't see very often at all, but comes up from time to time. So grand larceny would be things like theft of goods or money above a certain threshold. I think it's $1,000, or theft of a debit card or a credit card is considered grand larceny. And so if someone has stolen your credit card, even if it is your spouse, if that was without your consent, that would be a family offense, and it would allow you to go into family court and ask for an order of protection. Can I have the next slide, please, Naomi? So what is the good of an order of protection? Well, it is an order from the family court judge or referee, basically ordering your abuser to abide by certain conditions. So depending on the abuse and what you're asking for, it could be a full stay away, which means that your abuser has to stay away from you, your home, your child's school maybe. Importantly, in the context of financial abuse, they can be ordered to stay away from your job, and also ordered to not contact you via email, Facebook message, text message, etc. If you live together and you get a full stay away order, that means that your abuser also has to leave the home. And then the other type of order protection that lawyers refer to commonly as a refrain from or a limited order protection. And that means that your abuser doesn't necessarily have to stay away from you or move out of the home, but they are ordered to refrain from certain things. Basically, they are told by a judge, you cannot commit these crimes and family offenses. Which maybe sounds like, what's the point of getting an order saying they can't commit a crime because it's a crime either way? The point is that you have an order of protection against someone and they violate that order of protection, it gives you additional remedies. So in other words, if you call the police for a violation, they must arrest that person for the violation. They have no discretion in that. And sometimes it really is just the difference between someone thinking that they can get away with behavior and being told by a judge that this behavior is wrong and that they can no longer get away with it. Some other things to think about when you're thinking in the financial abuse context, they're not on the slide, but in a family court order protection, you can also actually ask for child support as part of the order protection. That has been traditionally fairly uncommon in the New York family court system, but interestingly, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, family courts are partially closed for many things, including child support filings. So you cannot actually go to family court in New York City right now to file for and seek a new order of child support, but you can get into family court for an emergency order of protection. So if you need child support as part of your order of protection, then that is definitely a way to ask for it, and it's something to keep in mind. Another thing you can ask for is for the judge to order your abuser to return your ID documents. So Anna Maria mentioned that part of financial abuse can be that they steal your documents and you can't use them to get a job. You can actually have your abuser ordered to give them back. And finally, this is also fairly uncommon, but you can ask for financial restitution in an order of protection. So if you have specific questions or if you want to explore that avenue with a lawyer, I would strongly urge you to contact a lawyer. As it happens, Her Justice advises on orders of protection, so we're going to be sharing our helpline number at the end of this presentation. Thanks, Naomi. So the next thing that I want to talk about in family law is child support. And as I mentioned, right now, because of the pandemic in family courts in New York City, They are accepting child support petitions by mail, but they are not moving forward on them. And so there's not right now a good way to ask for child support in the Family Court of New York. Everything is basically just closed and delayed. But under normal circumstances, if you are the custodial parent of a child under the age of 21, meaning that child lives with you more than half of the time, and you don't need to have a custody order expressly about custody to be the custodial parent, it's really just about who does the child spend most of their time with, then you are entitled to collect child support from the other parent. So again, normally you would go to family courts. You can also ask for child support in a divorce, and I'm going to talk about divorce in just a moment. But basically you would be going and asking a support magistrate to determine the amount of child support for you. Naomi, if you could go ahead one slide, please. Child support in New York is based on a percentage of the other parent's income. It's actually a slightly more complicated formula than that, but for purposes of just sort of understanding how it works, effectively it is a percentage of the other parent's income based on how many children you have together. So you can see from this slide that with one child, you would be getting 17% of the other parent's income, 2 children, 25%, and so on. And so it's typically not considered what your expenses are. There are some circumstances where the expenses of the child do come into play, but most of the time it is based on what the other parent makes. And so essentially their income is the most important question in a child support question. You can also ask for the other parent to pay their fair share of unreimbursed medical. So in other words, co-pays for medical for the children, and also for childcare. If you need to pay for childcare for yourself to go to work, then you can ask the other parent to pay their share of childcare. And this is particularly important in a pandemic for our essential workers who, need to access childcare. So that is child support. Naomi, if you could move forward to divorce, and then the next slide, please. So divorce is a whole topic unto itself, and we have 2 and 3 hour trainings about divorce for our pro bono attorneys. But for purposes of this financial abuse training, I just want to touch on some of the financial issues that can be dealt with in a divorce. And obviously a divorce is something that can only be filed between parties who are legally married. And so some of the things that I'm going to talk about here, unfortunately, would not be available to partners who only have a child in common or who only live together. There's no such thing as common law marriage in New York. So you need to have that legal marriage certificate to be able to access the divorce and the things I'm going to talk about. But instead of going to family court, you can ask for child support in your divorce. You can also ask for equitable distribution of marital property and debt. In other words, you can ask a judge to figure out all your marital assets and all your marital debts and divide them fairly. Equitable distribution does not necessarily mean equal 50-50, but it can. And so if you have specific questions about how a judge might divide your assets and debts, you should speak to a lawyer about that. And finally, spousal maintenance is New York's term for what other states would call alimony. So if there has been one party in the marriage who has been working and someone else has not, then the lower income spouse might be entitled to some alimony or spousal maintenance. So Naomi, if you could just forward the presentation, please. I want to talk really quickly about distribution of debts. And again, this is something to speak to an attorney at length about if you want to ask about your specific situation. But generally, what a court is interested in a divorce is knowing which debts are separate and which debts are marital. And generally, marital debt, the presumption is that any debts incurred during the marriage, from time that the marriage happened to the time that one party files for divorce, would be presumed to be marital debt, except if they're really only for the benefit of one person. So you can't divide student loans that were only for one party to get a degree, because you can't divide the degree either. So you keep the loans, you keep the degree. There's also ways to get one party to be responsible for the debts if those debts were a result of what we call marital waste. So if they basically took all this spending and didn't spend it on the family, and that would also be true if the debts were coerced, as Naomi talked about. If you convince the judge, the divorce judge, that these debts were coerced and it was not your client's choice to have them, then it might be that you can get an order that the other spouse pays for the debts. But as Naomi alluded to, that's only of limited use to you, because if you get a judgment of divorce and it says your spouse has to pay this debt, but your name is the one on it. So if your spouse was an authorized user on your credit card and they took that credit card in a spending spree and ran up $15,000, and the divorce judge says, yeah, that was marital waste, your spouse has to pay for it, Citibank or whoever owns your credit card, they're still coming after you because they're not a party to your divorce action. It's not, you know, spouse versus Citibank. So they're going to come after you. And then what you have is a right to indemnification, which is a legal term basically that means you can turn around and sue your spouse to make them pay you back for Citibank suing you, but that's just buying you having to sue your spouse again later. So it's not a great system. It's not really a perfect way to deal with your debts, but it is something that you should keep in mind if you're considering divorce. Naomi, can I have the next slide, please? Finally, I just want to talk about spousal maintenance. And as I mentioned already, this is something that's intended to be paid from the quote unquote moneyed spouse to the quote unquote non-moneyed spouse. So if each of the spouses has approximately equivalent incomes or earning potential, then you're unlikely to be dealing with spousal maintenance. So we're talking about, you know, a sort of textbook case of maintenance would be if one spouse stayed home to raise the children and run the household while the other spouse went out and worked. And, you know, as a result, over a 20-year marriage, that working spouse received promotions and assets and their income was high, and the spouse who stayed home, their income is low. Then spousal maintenance, the purpose of it in New York law is to kind of rebalance that so that the non-moneyed spouse has a way to support themselves coming out of the marriage. And so it is, like child support, is based on a formula. It's a very complex formula, but essentially it takes into account both parties' incomes or their earning potential. And I keep saying earning potential because if someone is young and relatively healthy, then they might be presumed to at least be able to work at a minimum wage level outside of the marriage. It depends on a lot of factors. One of those factors can be domestic violence. So if because of the domestic violence you are unable to work, either because you have become disabled or there's some other factor that has interfered with your employment, then that could be taken into account. And finally, the longer the marriage, the longer the period of post-judgment maintenance will probably be. So if the marriage is short, then you might only be looking at a few months, if that, of maintenance after the judgment of divorce is finalized. But in a long-term marriage, you might get significant post-judgment maintenance. And sometimes in really long-term marriages, the maintenance may last until retirement or some other thing kicks in and the retirement assets are available to continue living off of. So Naomi, if you can go to the next slide. I think that was my last slide on family matrimonial. There it goes. Yeah. So I don't know, are there any questions relating to divorce?
Not relating to divorce.
Question. Yeah.
We got a question about whether there's legislation around the credit card issue that you mentioned. If your spouse, takes your credit card and racks up debt, and could, is it possible to separate your liabilities to the bank from your spouse's? And I was just about to answer it, that the answer is not in New York State. You don't have the right to sort of assign the liability to your spouse in that way. Only a matrimonial court can do it, but it's this 3-step process that Anna was talking about. But we'd definitely be interested if folks are interested in looking at a legislative fix to this issue. Please reach out. We'd be happy to talk to folks about it and see if there's room for advocacy there.
And there are other states that have attempted to address this. Texas recently passed a law defining coerced debt as a form of identity theft, making it a defense to a consumer debt lawsuit. Similarly, scholars have proposed other solutions where, for instance, a family or a matrimonial court could certify that a person was the victim of financial abuse and that the debt was the result of coercion. So there's not currently legislative fixes in New York State, but there are ideas, and hopefully, the economic will.
So we're way over time, but there was one question I did want to ask on behalf of everyone to Naomi, because I think it's a critical one, and it's related to safety planning. So Naomi, if you could talk a little bit about what would be the first step for someone who is either feeling overwhelmed because they need to get their finances in order, or who suspects that they may be a victim of financial abuse and needs to sort of start gathering information. What would you recommend as the first steps for that person?
So I always tell, because clients really don't want to look at their finances. I think we all have that fear and anxiety. And so the first step is knowing that information is power. We run a credit report with every single one of our clients that we assess for a divorce. Another important thing to look at is bank accounts to see whether or not there are, any unfamiliar activity on your bank accounts. But it really just to kind of understand where you're at. A credit report is a really important place to start. We always go to annualcreditreport.com to allow people to run all 3 of their major credit reports for free. It's by federal law, you're right to see your credit report for free once a year. During the pandemic, you're actually allowed to check it, I think, every week for free. So that's one little perk of this really fun year. But that's just a normal financial health activity to take. And you're looking for unfamiliar things, you're looking for mistakes, and you're looking for things you might have forgotten about, or things that actually are unfamiliar, whether that's accounts you don't know about or hard inquiries, meaning someone's applied for credit in your name and you didn't know about it. So that's a big one. In our resource list, we've provided some information on where you might obtain free financial counseling. New York City offers it. So if you call 311 or you go to the link that we provided in the resource list, you can schedule a virtual appointment. There's also a really wonderful organization that we've worked with before called Savvy Ladies that has a helpline staffed by volunteer financial planners that may be able to talk to you about how to prioritize debts or budget your income and outgoing bills. And again, doing that would require looking at your own financial information first and foremost. And then there's, a good resource, especially for immigrant clients who may need to open a bank account or get an ITIN number. New Economy Project is a super wonderful resource. So please answer the survey that Mike is sending out to everyone. If you'd like to receive our list of resources and some handy pamphlets we have from other organizations as well about the issues that we've talked about today.
Naomi, we just got a question. Someone wanted to know if there are safety issues with checking your credit report.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So one thing that is entailed by abuse is the area of cyber stalking. And one way that abusers may track their victims is by running their credit report to see, where they've been banking, where they've taken out credit, where their current address is. Because the creepy thing about running your credit report is realizing that literally everything about your life is on it, from your employer to your current address. So there are a lot of depending on where someone might be in their safety planning, different things you might want to do. But definitely talk to an advocate if you're concerned about that, and they can help you kind of problem solve around how to run that credit report. Sometimes I'm able to run a credit report based on someone's previous address that an abuser might have already known about, instead of kind of adding to that potential information that they have on you. But there may be safety planning things that people need to do around who they give their personal address to in terms of financial institutions.
So we have a few more slides to get through, but maybe Naomi, if you could just sort of advance through. What I'd like to do, since we're over time, is just sort of point you to these resources. And as we've been saying, we're going to be sharing these materials at the end of the presentation. So when you run your credit report, there are a few things that you can do if you find things that you don't recognize. Basically, going to law enforcement or a reporting agency is are some things you can do. One thing that we have mentioned already in this presentation, it's worth saying again, is that a lot of the things that help with reporting false or fraudulent information on your credit report do require having a police report. And it can sometimes be challenging to get a police report for a variety of reasons. But one of the things that we mentioned before is that there's this sort of misapprehension that ID theft between spouses is not illegal. And so if anyone has trouble getting the police to take a report on something, it's worth contacting a consumer advocate and maybe getting some advocacy around that. Naomi, if you could go to the next slide. There's some sort of checklist things that, all sort of financial safety plans encompass if you're thinking about leaving a relationship that is financially abusive. We've put some bullets on this slide, and one of the pamphlets that we're going to be sharing also has a discussion of safety planning, things like collecting important documents, keeping them in a safe place, changing your password. But one important thing to remember is that if you start doing this financial activity, like putting all your money in a separate account or changing passwords or things like that, that might alert the abuser that something is up. So it is really always important to speak to an advocate and do a real comprehensive safety plan around those things. And finally, we've included at the end of this presentation some ideas about debt prioritization. If you are struggling to pay all your bills every month, there are certain things that you should prioritize first, like food and medication and rent and mortgage, things that are basic necessities for you and your children would be considered high priority. And low priority debts would be things like credit card debt, anything unsecured. So an unsecured debt means it's a debt that isn't attached to an asset. A secured debt is like a mortgage or a car loan where you have an asset that is guaranteeing that loan. But an unsecured debt, an example would be credit cards. And it's very tempting to prioritize your credit card payments very highly because these debt collectors have really abusive practices of calling you and harassing you and sort of making your life miserable. And that is all designed on purpose to make you think that their debt is the most important thing that you should be paying off. And that's just not the case. And as Naomi mentioned in her section, there are often very good defenses to these debts that you shouldn't be paying them at all. So again, if you're being harassed by debt collectors, then I would strongly encourage you to speak to a consumer debt attorney. And I think that covers that section. Naomi, do you want to wrap it up for us?
Yeah, so as we mentioned, this is our helpline number. It's not an emergency number. As you can see, it's only open on Thursdays from 10 to 1. It's our helpline for family and matrimonial law advice and counsel. So we're happy to answer questions there. We have, as I mentioned, we assess cases that come through with people asking about financial and matrimonial financial issues, but we are sharing a resource list with a lot of these answers. I know somebody in the chat mentioned the CFPB. Actually, the CFPB is a huge resource, additionally with a lot of materials that help consumers manage and know their rights around issues. On the identity theft issue, I also just wanted to mention the FTC is probably the first step you should go to understanding the list of to-do items you may need to do to address identity theft. And I also just wanted to acknowledge that the communities of color, especially in New York City, where we've got such a huge amount of poverty, and a lot of these issues impact people disproportionately based on their racial identity and the neighborhoods in which they live in New York based on the access to financial services. And also their access to law enforcement and ability to take advantage of the system that should be working better than it is. With that, I appreciate everybody coming today. I hope you enjoyed this. If you had questions, please do ask them in the survey so that we can assess whether there's need for follow-up sessions and emails to anybody with specific questions. And please join us for our future town hall events.
Yes, thank you all so much. And big thank you to Naomi, Anna, and Anna Maria. As I mentioned, yeah, definitely feel free to reach out to the helpline. Also, if you are from another organization and you would like to organize some sort of outreach event with Her Justice, please reach out to me. I put my email in the chat. And also, if you have any referrals that you need to send to Her Justice for clients, send them to me as well, or if you just need the materials. I think that is it. Like I said, like as Naomi said, please fill out the survey if you can. We would really appreciate it. And yeah, definitely let us know if you have any questions.